In the collect, we asked God to restore what He created. And in the second reading, Paul talks about to be renewed in our spirit. And those are nice words, restore and renew. They have a good feeling about them. They indicate that something good is going on. But I got to thinking about restore, renew, and I remembered a painting that I found that I liked a lot, and I found it rolled up and laying in a dank basement in Newport, and it was pretty badly damaged. And I took it around to find someone who would restore it, and no one would touch it because it was so badly damaged. But I finally found someone to try it. He said, I think I can do it, but I can't give you any guarantees. And I said, all right. So the first thing he did was strip off the varnish, the old varnish on it. And then he put it on a table. It was kind of cool. Had lights underneath that would light up, and not only would illuminate, but they heated up a little bit so that the oil started to melt. And then he could start to do his in-painting and stuff. And I recalled when I was younger, helping a buddy to restore an old car. And the first thing we did was tear it apart. We took everything off. We took the engine out, emptied out. We, steam cleaned the engine and the body. We had to sand it and everything else, And when it was finished, it was real nice. But what occurs to me is that the beginning of any renewal process or restoration process is first a tearing down. And I can imagine that if a painting had feelings or that car had feelings, it might wonder at first, hey, what's going on? This is worse than we had it before. And so the Israelites, starting their time in the desert, at some point start to complain to Moses, why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? We had flesh to eat, and we had bread. And if you think about it, they're saying, why didn't you just let us stay in slavery? And to us, it might sound very odd. Why in the world would you want to go back to slavery and the conditions under which you lived just for some food? But that is the way we are, And restoration begins with a kind of desert experience, and we tend to hang on to the things with which we're comfortable, the things we know, even when the new is better, because we don't like that desert experience. We don't like that change, And Paul describes it this way, that we must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. But he says, no, you should put away the old self of your former way of life, corrupted through your desires, deceitful desires. Be renewed in the spirit of your minds and put on the new self. We can't put on the new self until we get rid of the old. We don't like getting rid of the old because it can be painful. I remembered a short section from one of the Chronicles of Narnia. And Eustace is a rather obnoxious cousin to the four children in the beginning, Edmund is one of the children. And Eustace has become so set in his ways, his obnoxious ways, that it's actually changed him. And at some point, though, the Aslan takes him out of the old ways. And here's the way he described it. Then the lion said, but I don't know if he spoke, "You will have to let me undress you." Eustace by this time wanted to be free of his old ways, right? "I was afraid of his claws, I can tell you, but I was pretty nearly desperate now, so I just lay flat down on my back and let him do it. The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off," see, he had become a dragon. That's how set in his terrible ways he had become. "When he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off. You know, if you've ever picked the scab of a sore place, it hurts like Billy O, but it is such fun to see it coming away." "I know exactly what you mean," said Edmund. And then Eustace continues, "Well, he peeled the beastly stuff right off, just as I thought I'd done it myself the other 3 times, only they hadn't hurt. And there it was, lying on the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and more knobbly looking than the others had been. And there I was, smooth and soft as a peeled switch, and smaller than I had been. Then he caught hold of me. I didn't like that much, for I was very tender underneath, now that I'd no skin on, and threw me into the water. It smarted like anything, but only for a moment. And after that it became perfectly delicious. And as soon as I started swimming and splashing, I found that all the pain had gone from my arm. And then I saw why. I'd turned into a boy again." I think that this process, this desert process of being renewed, goes for us individually, but also for the church. And individually, of course, it means we have to give ourselves to God and let Him renew us and restore us. We can't do it ourselves. Eustace tried, but it kept growing back. To give ourselves to God and let Him turn us away. You know, of course, we have to turn away ourselves, but let Him completely restore us, which means putting aside all those old things, old sins, maybe disobedience or disregard of church teaching or whatever, you know, old habits, maybe friends that are pulling us away from God. It's a difficult period, this restoration period, but it has to happen for us to be renewed. You know? But also for the church, I think that restoration period goes also. I think the church has been in a desert period for a couple of decades, you know. And we've all seen it. The church is getting smaller, and we know the statistics of how many Catholics practice their faith, etc., etc. And it's easy to get discouraged. But it's possible we're in, as Pope Benedict at the time said, we're in a period of restoration, and he says, perhaps the church has to become smaller until she can get strong again, before she can be the light that she's supposed to be to the world, or the salt for the earth. She has to be purified and renewed. You know. And in this time again, you know, here's one thing. We thought the sexual abuse scandal was over, and it's raising its ugly head again. And we realize, even though some suspected it before, we still haven't completely dealt with it. And now we have cardinals and archbishops and whatever, people who are supposed to be in charge of the restoration. Now we see that they were involved in the same thing themselves. A little bit pedophile, not much, mostly just homosexual acting out, you know. And it can be a difficult period here for the church. Ralph Martin has a good letter, I think, in the National Catholic Register. It might be worthwhile reading for you. But God didn't lead Israel out into the desert and then just let them go. No, He guided them. And He gave them a food that would sustain them through their journey, manna. God doesn't leave us either individually or doesn't leave the church just to wander aimlessly in the desert. He leads us into the desert so as to restore us. And while he's restoring us, he sustains us, especially with the Eucharist. Both individually and as a church, the Eucharist will bring us through any desert time. And we're reminded in the Psalms, not to put our trust in human beings, in princes, whatever, but to trust in God alone. And so we realize in this period, just a reminder, we don't put our trust in the number of people coming to Mass. We don't put our trust in how well the church is thought of in the society. We don't even put our trust in bishops and archbishops and priests and popes. We put our trust in the Lord our God. And we cling to the Eucharist so that we can be sustained through the difficult period of our own restoration and also the restoration of the church.